This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Our speaker for today is Valerie Balint. Valerie is the program manager of Historic Artists' Homes and Studios, which is based in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts. She is the former interim director of collections and research at Frederick Church's Alana and a longtime advocate of preserved artist spaces and public art. And we are very excited to have her present on this topic for us. Thank you, Valerie, and it is all yours.
Thank you, Jen. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. There we go. And okay. So, good afternoon, and thank you, Jenny, for the lovely introduction. As a resident of Rhinebeck, I'm so excited to be presenting for people who are part of my own community. As Jenny noted, I'm Valerie Balint, and I head the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which we affectionately refer to by the acronym HOS, which I will do probably throughout this talk. We're so lucky here in the Hudson Valley to have such a strong legacy of so many artists, beginning with the Hudson River School artists of the mid-19th century, all the way up to the rich community of artists who live and work in our region today. But many of you may not know that some of these artists' homes and studios are preserved and open to the public and are part of a larger national network of sites. So I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to talk about the program and about the new guidebook we've launched. The National Trust created HOS in 1999 to support those places dedicated to national artistic legacy. And what began as a network of about only a dozen sites has grown to a membership consortium of 44 sites across 21 states, representing more than 300 artists spanning 3 centuries. Its administrative home is at Chesterwood, home of the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial, which is on the book's cover, which you see here on your screen. Collectively, these sites, all preserved and now open as public museums, provide opportunity to more than 1 million visitors annually to engage in place-based and immersive experience. This guidebook, excuse me, this guidebook represents the first time these sites have been brought together collectively with over 250 color images, and I sort of like to think of it as an Art Survey 101 course. 2019 marked the 20th anniversary of the program, and this book is a celebratory benchmark of how much we've grown, but also sort of a peek into our future vision. The book was generously funded with leading support from the Henry Luce Foundation and the Wyatt Foundation for American Art, both longtime supporters of HOS and leaders in philanthropy and American art. This is a unique publication. We deliberately set out to create a guidebook versus an exhibition catalog or scholarly text, and we hoped it would get people out to explore. It's meant to have you put it in your car, in your purse, in your backpack, but we also wanted it to serve as a sort of armchair travel and to sweep you away through its images and narratives. When we started the project, we could not anticipate COVID-19 realities, but we now hope that the book will first become dog-eared by people marking all the places they want to go, and then well-worn when people can embark on real serious travel again. Something I love about the program and the book is that we seek to represent the depth and breadth of the places where art was made in this country. From the converted urban commercial space in Chicago designed by 20th century imagist Roger Brown, which you see pictured in the sample entry on your screen, to the bucolic and rural American Impressionist colony in Old Lyme, where hundreds of artists such as Childe Hassam, pictured here on plein air painting, documented the beautiful scenes around them in literally thousands of works of art. To the log cabin studio Western painter Charlie Russell, built out of recycled telephone poles in the suburbs of Great Falls, Montana. to the Southern California workshop of and handmade home of furniture designer Sam Maloof, and honestly, everywhere in between. And today I hope to take you on our first short excursion. But first, I want to take a slight detour. This is the Lincoln Memorial, a monument we all know well. In fact, most of us have probably been there. Its impact transcends art. It's synonymous with ideas of national ideals of democracy, personal freedom, and social justice, the right to assemble in both protest and celebration. And it has become a place of pilgrimage for millions and is perhaps our nation's most famous piece of art in the world. But it is easy to forget that objects like this were made by a person and in a place. They were created through physical work and engagement with mental creativity and genius by artists who were contemporary and groundbreaking in their own eras, who lived in places that both inspired them and were transformed by them, in places where they played out their life narratives, where they enjoyed triumph and suffered loss, where they were as much people as they were artists, and I mean artists with a capital A. If art museums and gallery spaces or public monument is the output, these preserved sites represent all the input. And as preserved places that were once the locus of creativity, they are now uniquely poised to inspire visitors today. My own journey and artistic genesis began here at Chesterwood in Stockbridge, Mass., the home and sculptor of Daniel Chester French of the Lincoln Memorial. I visited here with a special arts program trip with my family at the age of 10. Yes, I learned about the Lincoln, but I also discovered how he built this ingenious rail track you see at Wright, just beyond the doors of his studio, to take works in progress out into the open air to view how changes in light and perspective would affect a piece. I roamed around the artist-designed garden and woodland walks, took in the majesty of the view of Monument Mountain, which inspired French to buy this piece of property. I heard about the family life he nurtured here as a respite from the rest of the year he spent at his studio in New York City, and how he called this place heaven. More than a decade later, when I went to apply for my first professional internship and saw an ad for Chesterwood, all the sensory power of that visit to me as a young girl came flooding back to me. I still actually feel it today when I'm there. I like to think of it as a sort of genius loci, a guiding spirit maybe of those who originally lived there perhaps, but also those like myself who are responsible for that legacy today. That is what every site in the network in this book has to offer. And I hope we've managed to evoke some of that within the pages. I like to think that what is offered at Chesterwood and all these sites is not so much an example of life imitating art, but as an integration of art and life. And I'll be talking a little bit about that more in the presentation. This book includes artists and places you may be familiar with and others who are awaiting your discovery. On the top row is Andrew Wyatt, the center figure in 3 generations of artists. His local boyhood home of Chadsford, Pennsylvania, and nearby Crooner Farm fueled him his entire career. He made works in a converted schoolhouse turned studio. To be there is to better understand the work and the complexities of this deeply introspective man. By contrast, on the bottom row is Grace Hudson, who you may not know anything about, a formally educated portrait artist who depicted the indigenous Pomo people and who, along with her husband, designed an arts and crafts home in Northern California's Mendocino Valley. Let's take a bit of a closer look and look inside. This is the actual sign on Andrew Wyatt's studio door. It lets you immediately know the nature of this person. But it's also a good reminder that these were ultimately private spaces and that we are entering the inner sanctum when we visit. It's interesting to see what various artists needed to inspire them or what environments they needed to surround themselves with in order to be productive. I think this is something we are all really thinking about right now. How to work from home, how to balance life and work, how these things are interconnected. Certainly, artists have always understood this. They don't stop being artists just when they close the studio door. So let's take a little journey together. I can't possibly get us to all 44 sites, but I do hope that this will serve as an enticement for you to discover more. Each of these sites and artists warrant entire seminars on their own, so I'm just going to barely scratch the surface. And I'm going to begin right here in our beloved Hudson Valley. Here is the artist who really started it all. English-born Thomas Cole, founder of the Hudson River School, the first homegrown national art movement in our country. It inspired generations of artists with landscape painting in this mode that you see at Wright, and artists are still inspired to paint this way today. His image is of our region's landscapes, like these types of lakes, which we're all familiar with, or let's say Catskill Falls, are well known to us. But they helped forge a national identity linked to our relationship to the land. And here is the home that he settled in with his wife and children, owned actually by her family. And that's the view that continues to draw thousands a year and that inspired him his entire career. Very rarely can we stand in a place where an art movement began and immerse ourselves in the physical environment that nurtured it. But we can do so here. Inside the Thomas Cole house, there are recently restored interiors during which they discovered decorative borders. You can see that at the top of the wall, designed by Cole. They actually just discovered yet another one on the second floor. And these are the types of sort of artistic expressions beyond painting that you actually have to go to the site to see. You can't see them anywhere else. Here you can learn about his art, but you're also able to learn about who he was as a person, his writings, his interest in music. That's different when you go to see his works on museum walls. Here is the outbuilding, which he used as a studio for most of his time here. You are immersed in this space of creativity when you're there, and that's what these places are all about. So many of the works that you may know by Thomas Cole were painted right here. But he had a great love of architecture and dreamed of building his own perfect studio on the property. Only a few years before his untimely death, he managed to make that dream a reality. The picture at the bottom left shows you the building he designed and erected during his lifetime. He died suddenly and unexpectedly, and within months, this studio became a place of pilgrimage from artists and devotees and patrons. And here is his daughter, Emily Cole, at lower right, seated in that studio, who remained a keeper of that flame. Ultimately, the building was deteriorated and was lost well before the site became a museum. In recent years, the site has rebuilt the studio to exact specifications, as you see on the top slide, and have adapted it for annual exhibitions. I love this site so much because it shows the evolution of the artist, his life, and his art practice over time through these various buildings and the landscape. And here is the next chapter of that story, that of Cole's student, Frederick Church. This is a great example of an artist who used their home as a laboratory for a way to move into multidisciplinary forms of exploration, expression, and experimentation, where a painter became an architect, landscape architect, and interior designer. Such is Olana, Church's home just outside of Hudson. As Jenny mentioned, I had the pleasure of working here on curatorial staff for 17 years, just before coming to take my position at Haas. This is a 250-acre work of art as an expression of the artist's greater sensibilities, crowned by a Persian fantasy house of his design. Church was a world traveler. Here he is in Beirut in 1868 with his young son. This was part of his image building as an explorer, capturing the far reaches of the globe that he then depicted in his artworks. Inside and Out is an amalgam of experiences had on his world travels and of his own imagination. I like to think he got the courage to do this through Cole's own foray into architecture, although taking it, of course, then in Olana to another level and scale entirely. The house represents ideas reinvented through Church's singular artistic prism. Stencils in the court hall, taking inspiration from tiled buildings seen in the Middle East, a window made of cut paper, pressure fit, between two pieces of amber glass, emulating the ambient light and screens he would have seen while traveling in the Middle East. And everywhere, as you can see, there are objects. This is often referred to as a Persian house, but it is a lot more complex at that. And I'm just going to show you a detail. This is one corner of one bookcase in that room. This is a butterfly he brought back from Colombia, hollowware on the left from Tehran, folk Mexican pottery on far right, and at the very farthest right, the 19th century blue Chinese ceramic draped by shells from Madagascar, given to him by another artist, Marianne North. These are not necessarily what we call in the museum field connoisseur objects. They are important because Church collected them. Yes, they are associative. They are trophies of travel of the sort, but the key is in the arranging. I would argue it's just the same as composing a painting. This is the type of work that brought him fame and fortune. This is Twilight in the Wilderness in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art. And this is the view from the other side of that room. This is the landscape beyond that Church took 40 years perfecting, and that's more than any single painting he would have worked on. Here, as other artists are in their homes, Church had no client, he had no commission, and therefore was completely unfettered and could explore his own sort of sensibilities of how else he would like to express himself creatively. For me, Church is a master of color, theatricality, and harmonizing intricate details within a greater sweeping composition. And all of this can be found here at Olana in new ways for us to discover if you're looking carefully enough. And this happens at so many sites. What is unique here is that we get to visit both sites and learn about the connection between Cole and Church, Hudson River School artists, and that legacy, potentially all in one day. And that is a singular experience and very rare. But these sites are inherently a fragile thing. For every site that we save, there are dozens that are lost. In fact, Olana and the Cole House really serve as touchstones for the entire Hudson River School group of artists. This is Church's biggest rival, Albert Bierstadt, best known for capturing the grand expanse of the American West. Like Church, he too built his dream home and studio in the valley. This is Malkistan, which he built several years after Church completes Olana. It was in Irvington on Hudson, near Tarrytown. Like Church's home, the landscape was part of the whole experience. And here you see several views. The house was featured in the 19th century in Art Journal. That's the image you see at upper left. And Church's house was actually featured in the same publication as were other artists and writers' homes of the era. These homes were famous in their own time. Here you also see a work by Bierstadt on upper right depicting his views of the Hudson River from his home. And here you can see a similar exotic interior. It reminds us a little bit of Olana, but also the props he would have used, particularly in his paintings, implements and elements from Western and indigenous culture. And on the upper arcade, you can see a series of artworks meant to impress clients, but also part of the studio installation. All of these give us insight into the artist and the process. And yes, we can learn a lot from these images, but imagine if we could actually go and immerse ourselves in this site today. Unfortunately, it was lost to fire in the artist's own lifetime, but there are other sites which did survive into the 20th century, only to be lost due to lack of preservation efforts. So it's amazing when these sites survive and then are opened for us to enjoy. But not all artists associated with the Hudson River School actually lived and worked in our area. This is Thomas Moran, best known for images also of the American West. His images are credited with helping to establish Yellowstone as a national park. Mount Moran in the Grand Tetons is actually named in honor of him. He started his career with a studio in New York City, like most artists. You may have heard of Thomas Moran, or may be familiar with some of his works, but you may not know that he was married to an equally talented artist, Mary Nemo Moran. Here she is seen in front of her garden, which she designed at their home in East Hampton, Long Island. She was best known as a printmaker, and you can see an example of her work here at Wright. These were the first artists to move out to the east end of Long Island permanently, which has ever since then really been and continues to be an enclave for artists. Like Church and Bierstadt, they designed their own home and landscape, although on a more modest scale. No exoticism for them. This is a typical Victorian mode of their era. And as you can see, they were inspired by their environment and they painted it. That's her image of the house and environs on lower left, and a similar painting by him of not the house per se, but nearby on lower right. Like at so many of these sites, when you visit, you really step into the paintings. They designed every aspect of this house themselves on a budget and with immense creativity. They used many salvage architectural elements being torn down in New York City. Yes, the decorative columns you see and sort of the mantle surrounds you see, but also things like windows from a candy store. They transported all of these objects out via the Long Island Railroad. This is a work and home space combined, thus the incredibly large windows that you see on the lower slide for the ability to get light in to work at an easel. There was in the upper arcade a gallery there to display art, but also to sell art. They were a very social couple and a lot of entertaining was done here. For decades after their death, this was derelict and its fate uncertain. It's now part of the East Hampton Historical Society. It was painstakingly restored in part using archival images such as this one on your upper right, which shows Mary in the space. Here is someone many of us feel we know. He's indeed one of the most well-known and beloved artists in this country, Winslow Homer. Here, Winslow Homer is in front of one of his marine paintings, painted at his home and studio in Proudsneck, Maine. The photo reinforces the image that we have of him as a grizzled recluse of a man holed up in a rugged Maine, an image actually he helped to perpetuate, by the way. By the time he moves here full-time, he has already become a well-known illustrator for Harper's Weekly, a documentarian of the Civil War, and a genre painter of pastoral and rural life, some of that work with direct ties to our own region. After the Civil War, he spent some time up in Hurley, New York, in Ulster County. He went there with artist friends. Many artists traveled and sketched together, and artists today still do the same. Homer created many paintings depicting the signature stone houses in Hurley, the family farms, and of course the schoolhouse. You can still go around Hurley today and see many of the places depicted in works from this period. Snap the Whip, probably one of his most famous works ever painted, can be traced directly to the Hurley School and his time spent in town. Also in the 1870s, Homer visited the home of his patron at Houghton Farm in Mountainville, New York, in Orange County. These delicate watercolors evoke the simplicity and nostalgia for an earlier time before the ravages of Civil War. But the landscapes they illustrate are certainly well known to us all who live here in the Valley. Soon Homer would leave New York City and sketching trips to our region for permanent residence in Maine. And in his late work, he would reinvent himself again. And many relate to his marine works most of all, even more than these types of works. In Maine, he lives and works out of a converted carriage barn, which is part of a bigger complex of buildings owned by his family. And that's now saved as a historic site. Notice there are fairly minimal windows, perhaps not what we've come to expect for a painter, but look at that balcony. And this is the view from that balcony, a sort of open air studio window, for lack of a better term. His brother used to say he would wear out the floorboards pacing on it. And this was a view that Homer came to know, of course, intimately. The cliff walk is just a short way from the studio. Either before or after your visit, you can see this painting at lower right, weather beaten, on view at the Portland Museum of Art, which owns the site. This view, when you are standing on the cliff walk, makes you understand Homer, what moved him as a man as well as an artist. You stand in the painting when you're there. You smell the salt, you feel the spray, and you taste it, and you hear the roar of that surf. It's insight into the mental process of art making and inspiration. But artistic legacy in the Hudson Valley is not restricted to the 19th century. This is the high school graduation picture of 20th century icon Edward Hopper. And this is a young man on the verge of something great. There's literally very little guile in his photograph. This is an artist who earned the rarefied accolade of a word in the English dictionary, Hopperesque. He grew up in Nyack, New York, in Rockland County, and at Wright is a painting owned by the Whitney, 7 a.m., Nyack, New York. And this was painted many, many years after Hopper left his childhood home. Today, you can actually do a walking tour linking places in Nyack to painted works. Rarely do we get to visit a site of artistic genesis, but this is one. Like so many artists, before you get your dream studio, in fact, if you ever do get a dream studio, your first studio is in a room in your house, and this was his bedroom. Hopper once said, there is a sort of elation about sunlight on the upper part of a house. The signature light that marks his entire career can be seen here when you stand in this space, streaming through the windows of his childhood home. And it shows you that inspiration is not always linear. Here also, you get to learn about the person behind the legend, his lifelong interest in boats, the bicycle that you see here that he used to ride all over town. And you see extremely early works. This one sketched on the back of, I think it was his, I think it was 8 years old, childhood report card. It doesn't mean he made the sketch at 8 years of age, but this is a very, very early work. The contemplation and isolation that mark the entire career of his work are already present here in something he would have done by the time he was a teenager. And it shows you that by the time he makes this sketch, he is already a fully formed artist. I wanted to show you a modernist counterpoint to this idea of the type of handmade house that Church created at Alana, and a very different type of house. Russell Wright was an industrial designer of furniture and tableware, and we include these types of artists as well in our network. He was also an author of a book entitled Guide to Modern Living, in which he and his wife laid out their aesthetic tenets, and that book is still available. Honestly, it's been reprinted and is a really wonderful read. He then manifested these ideas at his home in Garrison, New York. Here is the exterior. The home is called Dragon Rock as part of a larger compound named Manitoga. He built this completely out of a former industrial stone quarry site. The house is like a jewel nestled into the cliff face. Just beyond the picture frame is a ledge falling away to a deep pool and a series of small waterfalls he designed. You see a green roof there and a clearly modernist aesthetic, but there are also Japanese influences here. And if you look really, really carefully through the window, you can see a little dining room table. And here is that table from a different view. He used the natural outcroppings of the stone ledge to create various levels to his house. The tree that you see at the left provides structure and a natural element. Wright changed the decor with the seasons and experimented with lighting because he had started actually as a theater set designer. He had a deep interest in nature and organic form, and he experimented with all kinds of natural materials, like the butterfly screen you see on the right, made entirely of natural specimens. Elsewhere in the house, there are stone doorknobs and there are birch bark wrapped doorways. It's an interesting counterpoint, this sort of natural aesthetic, to the industrial nature of the types of work that Wright was producing for sale. And here is his studio. Wright also designed the landscape, which you can see through the windows, in this case as a series of outdoor rooms. He even wrote a guidebook to his walking trails, which you can still buy today. All of the artists I've discussed so far also had studios in New York City. This is the 10th Street Studio Building, the first purpose-built studio building in the country. Frederick Church, Albert Bierstadt, and Winslow Homer all had studios here. It was destroyed in the mid-20th century. It's a tragedy in my field, but a reminder of how important those spaces that we do preserve are. New York is the center of the American art world in the 19th century and today, and so it's important that we have preserved artist spaces there. And for many of us in the Hudson Valley, the city is an extension of our backyard. So I wanted to show you some examples you can visit. Here is an artist you might not know. His entire career was spent living and working in an urban environment. This is the Greenwich Village home of Hayden Gross, arts educator and direct carver. He immigrated to New York at 20 to escape an increasing anti-Semitic wave. He is self-proclaimed. He himself says he is an American dream story. And that's the type of narrative that these sites also have to offer when you visit. Universal stories of perseverance, triumph, and loss. And these help to break down the distance we sort of build up as that sort of genius artist. It brings them back down to just human beings who are living their life and working. Here is Hayden Gross seated in the studio he designed. And here it is today. And you can see how intact it is to the slide before. We can actually probably just honestly drop him right back in here. I've talked a lot about inspiration, but these sites are all about the physicality of art making. All the tools of the trade are here at the studio, the chisels, the sketches, the pencils, and you can start to make connections between his process and his finished works. And this happens time and time again at these sites. Because at the core, these are places where art was actually made. You have, as my colleague and scholar Wanda Korn, who wrote the foreword to the guidebook, she asserts, you've returned to the scene of the crime, and so you have. Once again, though, these sites offer us an ability to venture beyond the studio space. This shows one example of what I like to call consistent curatorial impulses of these artists. Here, Gross's own work is arranged among his collection of African masks, which were highly influential to his work, and works by colleagues such as Red Grooms and Raphael Sawyer, as well as those of European masters such as Renoir. And they sit alongside the trappings of everyday life, like the record player that you see sort of at the bottom. The composing of all these objects is an extension of what they do in the studio. Right now, I think we are keenly attuned to the decisions we make in our own home. Artists are fearless, and they give us permission to be so as well. As you have seen already, there are home decor inspiration within these book pages and at these sites. And they illustrate the concept that what color you paint your bedroom wall or your kitchen actually says something about who you are and what moves you. And this is so true as well for artists. Not everyone decides to build their dream house or studio from scratch, like Frederick Church at Awana. Some demonstrate their ingenious application of what we call in the preservation field, adaptive reuse. Here, on a grand scale, by someone whose name has become synonymous with modernism, Donald Judd. A sculptor, arts writer, and furniture designer, Judd turned an abandoned cast iron sewing factory in New York's Soho neighborhood into a place where he could experiment with his ideas about the permanent installation of art. Once complete, it was also a place for gathering to discuss ideas about art, an informal salon of sorts, which is what happens at many of these artist spaces. And he basically restored this multi-floor sewing factory one floor at a time. And here is an example of how his ideas manifested, combining living and workspace with furniture of his own design and works by contemporaries. And that's a Frank Stella work on the left. Here are two people many of us think we know. The lives and careers of Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock are epic. Drama on a scale warranting a major motion picture starring Ed Harris and Marcia Gay Harden. But they moved out of New York City to live together in a small hamlet beyond the center of East Hampton, in a small cottage painting in an outbuilding which overlooked a saltwater creek. And here they are in their respective processes and painting modes, which are both very, very active. And this is their studio, a former fishing shack / barn, which gives you no hint of the wonders that await inside. And here is the interior of that studio. When you visit, you stand on that floor and process is all around you. You are literally just in the middle of process. And that experience, I can tell you firsthand, is transformative. And here is a detail of that floor. You might think it's actually a painting at first. You may not like abstract expressionism. You may not know anything about abstract expressionism before you go, but you get it when you stand there. And if you have seen hundreds of Pollock paintings on museum walls, this makes it all come together for you in a new way. This is the embodiment of the physical processes of making art, and you just can't get that anywhere else. This is someone you probably don't know. I'm going to start to move outside of New York State now and introduce you to some of our artists in the network. Here is someone perhaps lesser known, Denver-based artist and teacher Vance Kirkland. He met with actually early critical success for his surrealist work, studying and working in New York City, but largely turned away from the commercial aspects of art making. He was the director at age 25 of the University of Denver School of Art, but he left only 3 years later in protest of the fact that they would not accredit those art classes. Undeterred, he soon started his own Kirkland School of Art the following year, which has now been preserved. This is an example of his dot painting work entitled Explosions on a Sun 1 Billion Light Years from Earth. And this gives you a sense of the deep thinker that he was. Kirkland had synesthesia, a condition in which there is sensory overlap. And in this case, Kirkland saw colors when he listened to music. He actually could not do both at the same time. It was too much stimulus. So he would listen to music and then he would go into his studio and paint what he had heard. And this is the interior of his studio workroom at left. Those are straps suspended from the ceiling where he would hang on his belly over large-scale works while he worked on them. Many artists create these types of aid to assist in process, and we can only learn about them when we visit their studios. Here you on the right, you see the work I showed you earlier in the context of those other objects that Kirkland collected and was drawn to, and which gives us further insight into the impulses of this artist. Here's a couple you also may not know, George L.K. Morris and Susie Frelinghuysen. And this is a site I was honored to work at many years ago, early in my career. It's a modernist counterpoint to many sites we have seen. And it's just over the New York border in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, in Lenox. This is an artist couple who were deeply involved in the American abstract artist movement and who also had homes in Paris and New York. Here in Lenox, they created a rural retreat designed in concert with a local architect. Here you see stucco and glass brick and a fresco in the garage breezeway designed by Morris. This is an experimental use of stucco for this climate. That's an understatement. So often these artists' homes stretch the boundaries of expression and design and frankly, practicality. This is one of the first modern structures in the state, built within the same period as Marcel Breuer's Gropius house. And the studio you see at left up on that, it's elevated a bit on the far left, is earlier still and predates the house to which it's attached to. This is based on Aux Enfants Studio in Paris by Le Corbusier, which Morris saw when he was studying as a young man in Paris with Cubist master Fernand Léger. This is a really interesting couple. He was an art critic and an editor, and she was also an opera singer. It's so indicative of the complex lives that these artists lived, and we seek to make these biographical details come alive in the book. Here's the living room, replete with Argentinian leather floor, Art Deco furnishings, and Susie's stunning piano. Beyond the large windows, a lush landscape, orchards, pool house await. This was a glamorous couple, and the house reflects that. But I want to draw attention to the murals at far right by Morris. Morris was a sculptor as well as a painter, and there are frescoes and bas-reliefs by George and Susie through the entire house. These are works of art that can only be seen here in the places for which they were made and designed, and many of the sites in Haas include these exclusive elements. For each site in the book, I sought to include a fun fact, and in this instance, when design costs of the house ran over, something maybe some of us ourselves have experienced, Morris sold Picasso's The Poet, which is an extremely famous painting, which was in his own collection. He sold it to Peggy Guggenheim to cover the costs of his home design project. Once part of the Guggenheim's personal collection, this now hangs in the museum. This is Susie Frelinghuysen's murals in the dining room, totally different style and palette than her husband. She has inserted corrugated metal into the fresco surface to create a sculpture element here. And here we enter Morris's studio. And yes, that is a very beautiful checkerboard marble floor in his studio workspace. But what you also see on display here is the rich Cubist collection amassed by this couple, including works by Picasso, Juan Gris, and George Braque, and hanging from the ceiling is an Alexander Calder. Many of these artists' sites contain collections of works by friends, colleagues, and people admired from previous generations, as well as their own works. And in some instances, the only places you can see these works are going to the site because for various reasons, they do not travel. I'd like to move south. This is Ann Norton, whose home and studio is in West Palm Beach, Florida, one of the newer sites in our network. Here, she's hard at work at this piece, Seven Figures, inspired by a cliff face in Utah. Inspiration for art can literally come from anywhere, and which you now see on display at her site today. Of course, the studio gives you the various aspects of sculpture making displayed, things like armatures for modeling clay and plaster models for the work we just saw, as well as rough-hewn logs awaiting further carving. But the studio space also includes less glamorous aspects and real aspects of the work of making art, such as the slop sink. But here in the book, there are details that you can linger on that might be missed when you visit a site in person. These are the complex patina potions and formulas that create surfaces on bronze sculpture. It's a little bit of alchemy. It's really the magic of what happens on the surface of any bronze work. And it evokes for me the same like childlike wonder when we all first start to sort of dig in our hands with modeling clay or finger painting. But this is what awaits you outside the studio. Again, like at Alana, multidisciplinary expression of art, architecture, and landscape. Those are monumental brickworks done only late in career, hand-formed and home-fired, completely integrated into a landscape of her design. As Norton faced terminal leukemia, she embarked on creating a lush tropical oasis in her suburban town with the goal to leave it to her community to enjoy in perpetuity. And I love this story because it's so personal. It speaks to the human basic desire to create and to connect and honestly to endure. It's also a preservation story. All these sites were saved through effort, at times by the artist and at other times by people who were fiercely committed to ensuring this legacy, such as Olana and the Thomas Cole House. This is an important aspect of these sites that we also try to touch upon in the book. Here, perhaps, though, is the most famous woman in American art history. Georgia O'Keeffe's home and compound in Abiquiu, New Mexico is almost as epic as she is. The infamous black door in the inner courtyard was the subject of more than 20 paintings by O'Keeffe. The desert landscape that inspired her became synonymous with the artist and her work. She actually had to wait years until the Catholic Church would agree to sell her this site. And then she painstakingly made it her own through preservation of the traditional adobe, but while also adding modern touches such as the large 1950s picture windows you see to optimize her expansive views. And here is the interior looking out through one of those picture windows at her cottonwood trees, another favored subject by the artist. The aesthete spare quality is representative of her modern sensibilities and is punctuated with few objects like this Vertoya bird chair, which almost serves like a sculpture in the room. And this all may seem very expected and familiar when we think of O'Keeffe's work. But the book reveals the most crowded room in the house, the kitchen and the pantry. The artist was a foodie and grew her own staples on site and made her own yogurt and was incredibly dedicated to sustainability. Her gardens have been recently restored and can be enjoyed by visitors today. As a comparison, a Grant Wood space in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, this is the painter of one of the most appropriated images in all of the visual art lexicon, American Gothic at Wright. I've seen this on beach towels, paper dolls, lunch boxes, you name it, using this image. This photo of Wood shows the persona he sought to create. White shirt, black wingtip shoes and overalls, referencing him to both farm and factory workers of the region. But this is in fact part personal branding and persona making. Wood had actually traveled to Europe and studied there and was an incredibly cosmopolitan artist. All the really good ideas I ever had came to me while milking a cow. This is a quote by Wood, probably a little more of that persona making. Each chapter in the book begins with artist quotes like this one and giving us a bit of entree into the personality, in this case, the sharp wit of the artist. But here is the interior of his home and studio in a converted garage given to him by patrons. This is a masterwork of DIY and loft living. Literally no space is wasted here, and it's under 1,000 square feet. He lived here with other family. He made a bathtub out of an old hay chute space, and it makes us remember that Wood actually didn't start as a painter, but as a decorative arts artist. That's a bushel basket that he manipulated to make as a stove mantle, and the metalwork is of his own design as a radiator screen and on all the light fixtures. This small, humble space is a reminder that many artists struggle financially in their own era, and that the masterworks we all know today were actually created in these types of modest spaces. Another aspect of his wry sense of humor was his front door, made from a coffin lid because the funeral home was just next door. He painted on a glass clock, which denotes things such as taking a bath and having a party. The satire of his paintings finds expression in his own home, and we understand that this is an intrinsic part of who he is and not just what he depicts in his art. Conceptual artist David Ireland adapted his own space from a Victorian home in San Francisco's Mission District. It's the former home and sales room of an accordion salesman, and you can even see the gilded sign lettering still in the window on the bottom right of that building. Here, David Ireland is creating a sculpture by tossing concrete between his hands until it becomes a perfect sphere, and that gives us a sense of what's to come inside. This is the ultimate in DIY. He did a series of what he deemed maintenance actions, returning architecture to its bones. You can actually see the exposed window casements at Wright, and this was part homeowner's restoration and part art performance. He would actually film himself doing these actions, and that would in turn become a work of art. He recorded the cracks and history of the plaster walls through numerous coats of polyurethane. That's what you see here. And today, when you step inside there, it glows like amber, and it's like you stepped inside a small little lacquer jewel box. He used everyday objects to transfer them into works of art. Yes, that's a chandelier made from propane torches. And on the mantle at left, you see a sculpture made of jarred dirt collected while he was actually cleaning up. This site breaks conventional ideas of home and studio altogether. The whole thing is really just one big, large art project. This is also a newer site, just saved within the last few years. I wanted to convey that these types of sites are not static and more are coming online all the time. Just last month, the Midwest Home and Production Studio of Bob Ross of PBS fame opened to the public. Helping to guide those artists and descendants or preservationists through the process of becoming a public institution is a vital part of the work we do. I want to conclude by just touching upon the types of artists who are underrepresented or do not traditionally fit into the mainframe of art history, what we refer to as the art history canon with a capital C. We are actively seeking to bring more artists like this into the network. And by this, I mean self-taught artists, folk artists, indigenous artists, and people of color. Clementine Hunter worked her whole life as a field laborer and later as a domestic staff at a plantation in rural Louisiana. She did not even begin to create art until she was in her 50s and a grandmother, using discarded materials from a visiting artist who came to see the head of household of the plantation. And it just goes to show you that it's really never too late to tap into the creativity that frankly lies in all of us. Once she started, she painted on everything: cardboard, mugs, cigar boxes, really anything she could get her hands on. And because she had very little financial means, she thinned her paint to make it last longer. This is one of the buildings on the plantation where she lived and worked. It was designed, built, and used by slaves in an earlier generation than Clem, who was actually born emancipated. And here is what she created on the space's upper floor, a series of murals depicting her life on the plantation, including cotton picking, washing day, and here at left, going to church. I like to think of this as a bit of reclaiming and reappropriating this space by her and on her terms. But this is in part because she would have never been able to actually build her own signature home and studio like some of the artists who have been in this lecture. We used to call this work outsider art, but now we call it insider art. This really is only a very particular story that she is uniquely poised to tell. Her narrative is inspiring, but it also reminds us of the work to be done in validating these contributions to our artistic legacy through preserved spaces. We're excited that by the end of 2020, Historic Artists' Homes and Studios will be announcing several new sites into the network, all centered around strong women's narratives, fitting into this centennial year of the 19th Amendment. I hope this lecture will start you on your own journey, both through this book and to these amazing sites, every one of which is singular and a gem in their own right. And I hope the book offers rich virtual travel until such time as people venture out again. I think I've done my work. If I have brought something good, and interesting for both the person who has never studied art before, and also, if you are, let's say, an extreme devotee of Frederick Church, that I've actually included something new for you to discover within the pages. Many of these sites remain closed for the immediate future, but they offer a lot of digital programming, including virtual tours at this time. But many also have opened their landscape for respite and renewal during these unprecedented times. And these include sites such as Olana, the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, and Manitoga. So I'd consider making an outdoor visit. Please consult with individual sites to see about opportunities for visitation. The book is available at all major retailers and through our publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, and exclusive signed copies are available at chesterwood.org. Thank you.